Good afternoon, it's Mark Larson, and I'm here to give you the public health COVID-19 update. So I think we'll start with questions today, and then I'll kind of round it up at the end to talk about our variance requests. So let's start with questions.
Why can't we utilize the Washington State Department of Transportation signs along I-90 to remind people that our county is closed due to COVID-19 and that camping is not allowed this weekend?
So our PIO has reached out, as well as our incident management team has reached out to the authorities that kind of control those reader boards, and it's a complicated process to get messaging on there, and the messages that have to go on there don't just affect us, but they affect other counties. So we have had some messages out there, but there won't be messages out there this weekend in regards to not camping, and folks do know that they're not supposed to travel, and they know they're just not supposed to be camping. So we're using those reader boards when we can, but we probably won't be using them this weekend.
How many COVID cases are in Kittitas County currently?
We currently have 66 cases. Not all of those have recovered, so we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but we had one new case today related to our Twin Cities outbreak, and that's kind of what we expect to see, is that every day we'll have a few more trickle in, but it does show that the process is working.
With as technologically advanced as our state is positioned, why is it that there's no reporting of the number of COVID-19 recovered individuals for the state as a whole showing on the COVID-19 dashboard administered by the Center of Systems Science and Engineering at Johns Hopkins University? Can you reach out and find an answer to this question?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there is a lot of technology out there. There's also a lot of different ways of looking at things, and the question of recovered is a tricky question. So we are currently using recovered as when those people can return to work. So that's the definition we're using. The state has not kind of come up with a definitive definition of what recovered is. There's some discussion of whether that should be 28 days. Should it be when the person is not shedding virus anymore? So since a definition that everybody can agree with has not been clarified, that's why you don't see that on the dashboards from the state.
We received numerous questions in regard to returning to work with Twin City food employees. Can you speak to that process and what that looks like?
Yeah, so returning to work is interesting, and it's a moving target. And some of it depends on what kind of industries you work in. Some of it depends on whether you're symptomatic anymore. So I'm going to take the easier question, although it's nuanced as well. So the easier question is, what is a quarantine? So a quarantine, if I was positive, I would be in isolation. My family would be in quarantine. Because they don't have the disease, those people have to be in quarantine for 14 days. That is the cycle of the virus. So even though I would be able to go back to work within 10 days and 72 hours when my symptoms ended, so at least 10 days and sometimes longer if I've had symptoms at the end of that, but if I was asymptomatic, it would be 10 days. My family is in quarantine longer than I would be in isolation because they're still at risk of getting the disease. So as far as Twin City Foods go, we let people go back to work when they have reached that 10 days. So their last day of work was the 7th. If you take 10 days from there, that's why they're able to go back to work on the 19th. But if somebody on the 18th was still having a cough and a fever, they would not be allowed to go back to work. So each one is being allowed to go back to work a little bit differently depending on where they are. The nice thing about Twin City Foods is that those folks are wearing masks, and so they're not spreading disease to each other. So in a healthcare setting, we actually let healthcare workers go back to work a little earlier than that with precautions because we need those people working. But the folks that are going back to work at Twin Cities are no longer infectious, but we are still having a few people. We had somebody the other day that we had to pull off of work because because he started having symptoms. So there's another issue, and I can't remember if the question comes up here later, but it talks about should we use a two-test method? You test somebody, they test positive, they have to have a negative test before they can return to work. That is a valid method. The problem with that method is that people can remain positive for a long, long period of time and not really be infectious. So we are not currently using that method with Twin City Foods because that was not the method that was recommended by the State Department of Health when we talked about our current outbreak.
One masking question. The question comes from an individual that talks about others not masking and whether or not with others not masking, if that person, because they're high risk, should be wearing an N95 out in public.
So we were masking to protect others. So when I put a mask on, that mask is to protect you from me. When somebody in healthcare, for example, is wearing an N95 mask, they are protecting themselves from that person. So whether somebody who's immunocompromised should probably be avoiding being out in public. That's probably the safest recommendation. But if you could be around other people that are wearing a mask, then they're protecting you. We're still trying to avoid wearing N95s for the general public because there's still not enough N95s, but you can get a KN95, which is basically a dust mask that you can get, and you could wear one of those. So it would be more protective, but the most protective thing would be stay at home.
Another question came in with multiple questions. Why is it illegal to drive? Why is it illegal to attend church? I thought the U.S. Constitution was still in effect with regards to individual rights. Have you suspended these?
Yes, this is not about individual rights. This is about infection, and this is about controlling a pandemic. So those questions all fall into that. People are allowed to drive. People are just not supposed to drive except for to do things that are necessary, like going to a doctor's appointment or going to the grocery store. And currently, people are allowed to have drive-in church. So there's a lot of things that are done during a pandemic, during an emergency situation, and that's where we are currently. It has nothing to do with your constitutional rights.
I recently heard of a hairstylist who's currently working on clients out of her salon. As so many of us stylists who are following the rules, this is very frustrating to all of us. We're patiently waiting to reopen in phase 2. What can be done about those who are violating the current law in place?
So you should report that to the Emergency Operations Center. And what I've been doing when I get a report of someone that's doing something that is outside the current phase, I will call that person. I did that a couple of times this week, and we will try some education with that person. That's the first step. Sometimes people will be cooperative with that, and sometimes people won't. We try to appeal to their better good, and there are other steps that can go forward from there, but that's our first step, so we'd like you to report that. I also would request that you still hang in there for phase 2. We're still on pause. We're going through the weekend. Early Tuesday morning, we'll be putting our report in, and I do expect that we will be granted the variance, but it kind of depends on what happens over the weekend.
With the farmers market opening Saturday, since they are considered a food source, can we expect there to not be any crafts for sale? Are we allowing people to come from out of town to sell their fruit and vegetables, which could be encouraging travel and not staying at home?
So the farmers market is starting on Saturday. There will not be any crafts. And there was a question about fruits and vegetables from coming out of the county. And if that turns out to be a problem, then we'll just have to address that on the back end. But our grocery stores get their fruits and vegetables from out of town as well. So there is some travel involved, but we try to keep it to a minimum.